The December wind cut through Marcus Thompson's worn jacket like a knife as he sat on the cold concrete steps of the subway station. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he held a small cardboard sign that read, "Veteran, anything helps." The words were written in careful block letters, faded from countless days of exposure to the elements. Around him, the bustling crowd of Christmas shoppers hurried past, their arms full of colorful packages and their faces bright with holiday cheer. Most people avoided eye contact with Marcus. Some crossed to the other side of the walkway when they saw him approaching. Others whispered among themselves, making assumptions about how he had ended up in this situation. The few who did acknowledge his presence often did so with a mixture of pity and disgust, dropping loose change into the paper cup beside him without ever looking him in the eye. "Look at this guy," sneered a well-dressed businessman as he walked past with his colleague. "Probably spent all his money on drugs or alcohol." These so-called veterans are all the same. They use their service as an excuse to beg. His companion nodded in agreement. "I bet half of them never even served. They just buy those military surplus jackets to get sympathy money. It's disgusting how they take advantage of people's patriotism." Marcus heard every word, but he kept his eyes focused on the ground. He had learned long ago that responding to such comments only made things worse. Instead, he pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders, trying to shield himself from both the bitter cold and the harsh judgments of strangers. The jacket itself told a story that few bothered to read. It was a genuine military field jacket, faded olive green with patches sewn carefully onto the chest and sleeves. Most people saw only the worn fabric and assumed it was a costume piece, but each patch represented years of dedicated service, dangerous missions, and sacrifices that civilians could never truly understand. On his left shoulder was a unit patch from the 82nd Airborne Division, its eagle and parachute emblem barely visible after years of wear. Below that, a combat infantry badge gleamed dully in the dim light of the station. But it was the small rectangular patch on his right chest that held the most significance, a simple black and white emblem that read Christmas Eve 2003 with a small cross underneath. As the afternoon wore on, the crowds grew thicker with last-minute shoppers. Children pressed their noses against store windows, pointing excitedly at toys and decorations. Couples walked hand in hand, discussing dinner plans and family gatherings. The sounds of holiday music drifted from nearby shops, mixing with the constant hum of traffic and conversation. Marcus watched it all with a mixture of longing and resignation. There had been a time when he too had been part of such scenes, when he had rushed through crowded streets with presents for his wife Sarah and their young daughter Emma. That felt like a lifetime ago now, though it had only been 3 years since everything fell apart. The memories came in waves, as they always did during the holiday season. He could still see Sarah's face when he returned from his final deployment, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. The distance that had grown between them during his multiple tours overseas had become an unbridgeable chasm. She had tried to be supportive, to understand the nightmares and the sudden startled reactions to loud noises, but eventually, the strain became too much. "I can't do this anymore, Marcus," she had said on a cold February morning, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I feel like I'm living with a stranger. The man I married. I don't know where he went." Emma, only 8 years old at the time, had clung to his leg as Sarah packed their bags. "Daddy, why is Mommy crying? Why are you both sad?" He had tried to explain in words that a child could understand. But how do you tell your daughter that the things you saw and did in war had changed you in ways that couldn't be undone? How do you make her understand that sometimes loving someone means letting them go, even when it tears your heart apart? The divorce had been finalized 6 months later. Sarah got custody of Emma, along with the house and most of their savings. Marcus hadn't fought it. He knew she was right. He wasn't the same man who had left for his first deployment all those years ago. The war had taken pieces of him that couldn't be replaced, leaving behind someone who jumped at unexpected sounds and woke up screaming from nightmares about things he could never speak aloud. He had tried to rebuild his life after the divorce. The VA had provided some counseling and job placement assistance, but the transition from military to civilian life proved more difficult than any mission he had faced overseas. Employers were hesitant to hire someone with his particular skill set, especially when background checks revealed the extent of his combat experience. The jobs he did manage to find, security guard, warehouse worker, construction laborer, never lasted long. Either his PTSD symptoms would interfere with his performance, or he would have conflicts with supervisors who didn't understand military protocol and precision. Slowly but steadily, Marcus's savings dwindled. First, he had to give up his apartment and move to a smaller place. Then, even that became unaffordable, and he found himself staying in cheap motels, paying by the week. When the money ran out completely, he discovered the harsh reality of homelessness, sleeping in his car until it was repossessed, then finding shelter wherever he could. The homeless shelter system was overcrowded and often more dangerous than sleeping on the streets. Marcus had learned to find quiet corners in subway stations, under bridges, or in doorways of closed businesses. He had also learned which areas to avoid, which times were safest for sleep, and how to make himself as invisible as possible to both criminals and police. But the hardest part wasn't the physical discomfort or even the constant hunger. It was the way society looked at him, or rather, how it looked through him. He had gone from being a respected soldier, a protector of freedom, to being seen as a burden, a failure, a cautionary tale about what happened when someone couldn't handle real life. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent years protecting the very people who now crossed the street to avoid him. He had risked his life in foreign countries to ensure that families like the ones hurrying past him could enjoy their freedom and prosperity. Yet now, when he needed help the most, that same society seemed determined to pretend he didn't exist. As the evening approached, and the temperature continued to drop, Marcus knew he needed to find somewhere warmer to spend the night. The subway station would close soon, and the security guards would make their rounds, moving along anyone who looked like they might be settling in for the night. He was gathering his few possessions when he noticed a commotion near the newsstand across the platform. A group of teenagers, probably college students home for winter break, were laughing loudly and pushing each other around. Their behavior was getting increasingly rowdy, and Marcus could see that other commuters were giving them a wide berth. The situation escalated quickly. One of the young men, clearly drunk, stumbled backward and knocked over an elderly woman who was trying to board the train. She fell hard, her purse scattering its contents across the dirty platform floor. Instead of helping her, the teenagers laughed even harder. "Watch where you're going, Grandma," one of them shouted. The woman struggled to get back on her feet, her face flushed with embarrassment and pain. Other passengers looked on with concern, but no one moved to help. Everyone seemed afraid of getting involved, of becoming targets themselves for the drunk and aggressive young men. Without thinking, Marcus stood up. His military training kicked in automatically, assessed the threat, protect the innocent, maintain order. He had done it thousands of times before in much more dangerous situations. The fact that he was homeless and hungry didn't change his fundamental character or his sense of duty. "Hey," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "That's enough." The teenagers turned toward him, their expressions shifting from amusement to mockery as they took in his appearance. They saw only a dirty homeless man with ratty clothes and an unkempt beard. They had no idea they were looking at someone who had survived multiple combat deployments, who had been trained in advanced warfare tactics, who had earned medals for valor under fire. "Oh great," one of them said sarcastically. "The local bum wants to play hero. Why don't you mind your own business, loser?" added another. "Shouldn't you be looking for your next bottle of cheap wine?" Marcus ignored the insults and moved toward the fallen woman. She was still on the ground, clearly shaken and possibly injured. Her glasses had been knocked off and lay broken nearby. As he knelt beside her, offering his hand to help her up, the teenager's taunts grew louder and more vicious. "Look at this guy. He probably smells worse than the subway toilets. I bet he hasn't had a shower in months. Someone should call security and have this creep removed." The elderly woman looked up at Marcus with frightened eyes, unsure whether to trust this stranger who looked so rough around the edges. But there was something in his expression, a gentleness mixed with strength, a genuine concern for her well-being, that made her reach out and take his offered hand. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" Marcus asked quietly, helping her to her feet with surprising gentleness. "Do you need medical attention?" She brushed off her coat and looked up at him with gratitude. "I think I'm okay, just shaken up." Thank you for helping me, young man. The teenagers weren't finished with their harassment. They had gathered closer now, forming a loose circle around Marcus and the woman. Their initial amusement had turned to something uglier, a pack mentality that fed on the vulnerability they perceived in their targets. This is pathetic, the apparent leader of the group said, stepping closer to Marcus. A homeless bum playing soldier boy. What's next? Are you going to tell us you're a war hero? He reached out and flicked at one of the patches on Marcus's jacket dismissively. These fake military patches don't fool anyone, you know. Real veterans don't end up as street trash. Marcus felt his jaw clench, but he maintained his composure. He had learned to control his anger through years of military discipline, though it took every ounce of his training to remain calm in the face of such disrespect. The young man continued his taunts, emboldened by what he saw as Marcus's weakness. I bet you bought this jacket at some surplus store and sewed on a bunch of fake patches to make people feel sorry for you. It's stolen valor, and it's disgusting. Around them, a crowd was beginning to form. Some people pulled out their phones, though it was unclear whether they were calling for help or simply recording what they expected to be entertaining content for social media. The train that had been waiting at the platform pulled away, leaving behind a growing audience for the confrontation. Marcus remained focused on the elderly woman, making sure she was steady on her feet and helping her gather her scattered belongings. He could feel the hostile energy from the teenagers, but he also sensed something else, the presence of someone watching intently from the edge of the crowd. The observer was a man in his 30s, wearing a simple black peacoat and jeans. Unlike the other spectators, he wasn't recording with his phone or whispering to companions. Instead, he was studying Marcus carefully, his trained eyes taking in details that others missed. He noticed the way Marcus carried himself despite his circumstances, the straight posture that years of military bearing had ingrained, the controlled movements that spoke of tactical awareness, the protective stance he had automatically assumed around the vulnerable elderly woman. But, most importantly, the observer's eyes were drawn to the patches on Marcus's jacket. While others saw only costume pieces or fake symbols, this man recognized authentic military insignia. His gaze lingered on the combat infantry badge, understanding its significance. He noted the 82nd Airborne patch and mentally calculated the timeline of service it represented. Then, his eyes fell on the small rectangular patch on the right side of Marcus's chest, and everything changed. Christmas Eve 2003. The observer's breath caught in his throat. He knew that patch, knew what it meant, knew the story behind it. His own hand unconsciously moved to touch a similar patch hidden beneath his civilian clothes. After all these years, after searching through VA hospitals and homeless shelters, after wondering what had happened to his fellow soldiers, he had finally found one of them. The teenagers were still harassing Marcus, their taunts growing more vicious by the minute. They had no idea that they were about to encounter someone whose perspective on the situation would be very different from their own. The observer stepped forward, moving through the crowd with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to command. As he drew closer, Marcus sensed his approach and glanced up, their eyes meeting for the first time in over 2 decades. Recognition flickered between them, not of faces, which had aged and changed, but of something deeper. The shared understanding that comes only from having faced death together, from having relied on each other when everything else fell apart, from having made it through when others didn't. The patch on Marcus's jacket seemed to glow in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the subway station, a small beacon that had finally guided 2 old soldiers back to each other after years of separation and struggle. The confrontation with the teenagers was about to take a very different turn. Neither Marcus nor his observer spoke yet, but the air between them crackled with the electricity of recognition. In that moment, the noise of the subway station seemed to fade away, replaced by memories of a distant Christmas Eve in a war zone, when a small group of soldiers had made a decision that would bond them forever. The elderly woman, now steady on her feet with her belongings gathered, looked between Marcus and the approaching stranger with confusion. She could sense that something significant was happening, though she couldn't understand what. The teenagers, oblivious to the shift in dynamics, continued their harassment with increasing boldness. They had no way of knowing that they were about to learn a lesson about respect, about service, and about the true meaning of the patches they had so carelessly dismissed as fake. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything, not just for Marcus, but for everyone who witnessed what was about to unfold on that cold December evening in the subway station. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison had been walking through the subway station on his way home from a routine briefing at the naval base when the commotion caught his attention. Even in civilian clothes, his trained eyes automatically scanned for threats and assessed tactical situations. What he saw was a group of drunk college students harassing an elderly woman and a homeless veteran, but something about the veteran made him pause. Jake had spent the better part of 2 decades in the Navy SEALs, including multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. He had learned to read people quickly and accurately. It was a skill that had kept him alive through countless dangerous missions. The homeless man helping the elderly woman moved with a familiarity that spoke of military training, despite his current circumstances. But it was the patch on the man's jacket that stopped Jake in his tracks. Christmas Eve 2003. Jake's hand instinctively moved to his own chest, where beneath his civilian clothes, he wore dog tags that bore the same date. His mind raced back to that night over 20 years ago, when he was a young SEAL on his first deployment, part of a joint operation that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. The memory came flooding back with startling clarity. It had been Christmas Eve in Fallujah, and Jake's SEAL team had been attached to an Army unit for a special reconnaissance mission. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value target, a terrorist leader responsible for numerous attacks on coalition forces, was meeting with his lieutenants in a compound on the outskirts of the city. The mission should have been routine. Get in, gather intelligence, get out. No direct engagement unless absolutely necessary. But, as Jake and his team had learned many times before, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. The compound had been much more heavily defended than intelligence had indicated. What was supposed to be a quick reconnaissance turned into a full-scale firefight when their position was discovered. Jake's SEAL team found themselves pinned down with limited ammunition and no clear escape route. That's when the Army unit attached to their mission made a decision that would haunt and inspire Jake for the rest of his life. Led by a sergeant whose name Jake would never forget, the soldiers launched a diversionary attack that drew enemy fire away from the SEAL team's position. It was a desperate gambit that gave Jake and his men the opening they needed to complete their mission and extract safely. The Army unit paid a heavy price for their heroism. 3 soldiers were killed in the firefight, and several others were wounded. Among the wounded was the sergeant who had made the call to save the SEALs, a young man named Marcus Thompson, who took shrapnel in his left leg and chest but continued fighting until every member of his unit was accounted for. Jake had visited Marcus in the field hospital 3 days later, wanting to personally thank the man who had saved his life and the lives of his teammates. They had talked for hours about the mission, about home, about their plans for when they finished their deployments. Marcus had shown Jake a picture of his wife Sarah and their baby daughter Emma, talking about how he couldn't wait to get home for good and be a proper father. "This is what I'm fighting for," Marcus had said, holding up the photo. "Not for politics or territories or any of that complicated stuff. Just for the right of that little girl to grow up safe and free." Jake had been deeply moved by Marcus's words and his sacrifice. Before leaving the hospital, he had given Marcus one of his SEAL team patches, a small token of respect and brotherhood between warriors who had shared something that civilians could never fully understand. In return, Marcus had given Jake a patch that his unit had created to commemorate that Christmas Eve mission. It was simple and understated, just the date and a small cross, but it represented one of the most significant nights in both their lives. "Wear it proudly," Marcus had said. "And remember that sometimes the best Christmas presents are the ones you give to complete strangers." They had promised to stay in touch after their deployments ended, but, like so many wartime friendships, their connection had been lost in the chaos of returning to civilian life. Jake had tried to look Marcus up a few times over the years, but, with only a name and a unit designation, his searches had led nowhere. Now, standing in a subway station 20 years later, Jake found himself staring at that same Christmas Eve patch on the jacket of a man who had clearly fallen on hard times. The homeless veteran being harassed by drunk college students was the same sergeant who had saved his life all those years ago. Marcus Thompson. the hero of Christmas Eve 2003. Reduced to begging for change on the streets while spoiled kids mocked his service and questioned his authenticity. Jake felt a surge of anger unlike anything he had experienced in years. Not the cold, controlled anger of a professional warrior, but the hot, personal rage of someone watching a brother being dishonored. His hands clenched into fists as he listened to the teenager's taunts. These fake military patches don't fool anyone, you know. Real veterans don't end up as street trash. The irony was almost unbearable. These kids had no idea that they were looking at a genuine American hero, a man who had literally saved the lives of Navy SEALs, and who bore scars both visible and invisible from his service to their country. Jake began moving through the crowd, his jaw set with determination. He had let 20 years pass without finding Marcus, without being there when his brother-in-arms clearly needed help. He wasn't going to let another minute pass without setting the record straight. As Jake approached, Marcus looked up from helping the elderly woman. Their eyes met across the crowd, and Jake saw a flicker of recognition pass through Marcus's weathered features. It was subtle. Years of living on the streets had taught Marcus to keep his emotions hidden, but Jake caught it. Marcus's gaze dropped to Jake's civilian clothes, taking in the quality of the fabric, the confident bearing, the obvious signs of someone who had made a successful transition to civilian life. There was no resentment in his eyes, just a quiet acknowledgement of the different paths their lives had taken since that night in Fallujah. The lead teenager, emboldened by what he perceived as Marcus's weakness, reached out and grabbed the Christmas Eve patch, threatening to tear it off. "This is what I think of your fake war stories, you pathetic loser." That's when Jake stepped forward, his voice cutting through the crowd noise with unmistakable authority. "Take your hands off that patch." The teenager turned around, expecting to see another bystander he could intimidate. Instead, he found himself face to face with a man whose presence radiated danger despite his casual appearance. Jake didn't look angry or aggressive. He looked calm, controlled, and absolutely certain of his ability to handle whatever came next. "And who the hell are you?" the teenager demanded, though his voice had lost some of its earlier bravado. Jake ignored the question and spoke directly to Marcus. "Sergeant Thompson, it's been a long time." The use of Marcus's rank and name sent a ripple through the crowd. Several people pulled out their phones, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. Marcus straightened slightly, muscle memory bringing him closer to attention despite his circumstances. "Yes, sir. It has been." The teenagers looked confused by this exchange, but they weren't ready to back down. The leader stepped between Jake and Marcus, his chest puffed out with artificial courage. "Look, whoever you are, this doesn't concern you. We're just having a little fun with the local homeless guy." Jake's eyes never left Marcus as he replied. "This man isn't just some homeless guy. He's Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson, 82nd Airborne Division, veteran of 3 combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan." He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "On Christmas Eve, 2003, Sergeant Thompson and his unit saved the lives of 4 Navy SEALs, including mine. He took enemy fire that was meant for us, and 3 of his fellow soldiers died covering our extraction." The crowd had grown silent, hanging on every word. The elderly woman looked at Marcus with new eyes, understanding finally, dawning on her face. The teenagers shifted uncomfortably, beginning to realize that they had badly misjudged the situation. Jake stepped closer to Marcus, close enough to see the details of his worn face, the lines carved by years of hardship and struggle. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 2 decades of gratitude and respect. "That patch you just grabbed isn't fake. It commemorates one of the most significant joint operations in the Iraq War. I know because I was there. I have the same patch, and I've worn it on every deployment since that night." Jake reached into his shirt and pulled out his dog tags, showing the crowd the matching Christmas Eve patch that he wore next to them. The resemblance was unmistakable. 2 patches, slightly different in wear but identical in meaning. "This man is a genuine American hero," Jake continued, his voice growing stronger. "While you were safe in your beds as children, he was fighting in some of the most dangerous places on earth to protect your freedom. The fact that he's fallen on hard times doesn't diminish his service or his sacrifice." The lead teenager tried to salvage some dignity. "How were we supposed to know?" He looks like every other homeless guy. Jake's response was swift and cutting. You weren't supposed to know his specific service record, but you were supposed to show basic human decency to someone who was clearly struggling. Instead, you chose mockery and cruelty. He turned to address the crowd that had gathered. How many of you walked past this man today without a second thought? How many of you made assumptions about why he's in his current situation? How many of you forgot that behind every homeless veteran is a story of service and sacrifice? The silence was deafening. People began to shift uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with both Jake and Marcus. The truth of his words hit home for many who recognized their own guilty behavior in his description. Jake turned back to Marcus, his voice softening. Sergeant, with your permission, I'd like to buy you dinner. We have a lot to catch up on. Marcus nodded slowly, his throat tight with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. To be recognized not just as a human being, but as the soldier he had once been, by someone who truly understood what that meant, it was overwhelming. As Jake helped Marcus gather his few possessions, the elderly woman stepped forward. She reached into her purse and pulled out a $20 bill, pressing it into Marcus's hand. Thank you for helping me, she said quietly. And thank you for your service. I'm sorry I didn't recognize a hero when I saw one. Her words seemed to break a spell over the crowd. One by one, other people began stepping forward. A businessman who had walked past Marcus earlier without acknowledgement pulled out his wallet. A young mother with children explained to her kids why it was important to help veterans. Even some of the subway station employees came over to show their respect. The teenagers, thoroughly chastened and humiliated, began to slink away. But Jake called out to stop them. Wait. They turned around reluctantly, expecting further punishment or humiliation. Instead, Jake's voice carried the tone of someone delivering a lesson rather than seeking revenge. You have an opportunity here, he said. You can walk away and forget this ever happened, or you can use this as a learning moment. There are thousands of homeless veterans in this city alone, many of them dealing with PTSD, depression, addiction, and other challenges that stem from their service. Jake paused to let his words sink in. If you really want to make amends, don't just apologize to Sergeant Thompson. Do something meaningful. Volunteer at a VA hospital. Donate to homeless shelters. Use your privilege and education to make a difference for people who sacrificed for your freedom. The lead teenager, properly humbled now, stepped forward. His voice was subdued as he addressed Marcus directly. I'm sorry, sir. What we did was wrong, and there's no excuse for it. You're right that we should have shown respect regardless of the circumstances. Marcus studied the young man's face for a moment, then nodded acceptance of his apology. We all make mistakes, he said quietly. What matters is what we do after we realize we've made them. As the crowd began to disperse, Jake and Marcus found themselves alone except for the elderly woman, who insisted on waiting to thank them both properly before catching her next train. 20 years, Jake said, shaking his head in amazement. I've wondered what happened to you so many times. I tried to look you up after I got back from my last deployment, but I never found any trace. Marcus managed a bitter smile. I wasn't exactly maintaining a high profile. After Sarah left and took Emma, I kind of dropped off the radar. Didn't see much point in staying connected to my old life. The pain in Marcus's voice was evident, and Jake felt his heart ache for his old friend. The man who had saved his life, who had been so full of hope and love for his family, had been broken by circumstances that no amount of military training could have prepared him for. Tell me what happened, Jake said gently. All of it. I have time, and I want to understand. As they walked toward the subway exit, Marcus began to share the story of the last 20 years. He told Jake about the nightmares that started after his final deployment, about the way they intensified after he returned home for good. He described the gradual deterioration of his marriage as Sarah struggled to connect with a man who jumped at sudden noises and woke up screaming from dreams he couldn't explain. She tried, Commander. She really did. But I couldn't shut it off, couldn't go back to being the man she married. Every time I looked at Emma, I saw the faces of the kids in Iraq and Afghanistan. The ones who didn't make it, the ones who were caught in crossfire, the ones whose fathers didn't come home. Jake listened without judgment, understanding all too well the invisible wounds that so many veterans carried. He had been fortunate. His SEAL team had comprehensive support systems, and his transition to civilian life had been carefully managed. But he knew that many soldiers, especially those from smaller units like Marcus's, didn't receive the same level of assistance. The divorce was finalized 3 years ago, Marcus continued. Sarah got custody, which was probably for the best. Emma was starting to be afraid of me after I had a flashback during one of her sleepovers. I grabbed her friend when she dropped a plate in the kitchen, thinking we were under attack. Jake winced at the image. He had experienced similar episodes himself, though his had been managed through therapy and medication. Did you get help from the VA? Marcus laughed bitterly. I tried. The waiting list for mental health services was 6 months long. When I finally got in to see someone, they gave me some pamphlets and a prescription for antidepressants that made me feel like a zombie. The job placement program helped me get work as a security guard, but I kept having incidents. What kind of incidents? Flashbacks during crowded events. Panic attacks when I heard unexpected noises. One time I tackled a teenager who was setting off fireworks in the parking lot I was patrolling. The kid wasn't hurt, but his parents pressed charges. After that, nobody wanted to hire me. Jake felt a growing sense of guilt as Marcus described the downward spiral that had led to his current situation. While Jake had been advancing through the ranks of the Navy, earning commendations, and building a successful career, the man who had saved his life had been struggling alone with demons that ultimately cost him everything. They emerged from the subway station into the cold night air. Christmas lights twinkled from nearby storefronts, and the sounds of holiday music drifted from restaurants and bars. It was a scene of warmth and celebration that seemed to highlight the contrast between Jake's comfortable civilian life and Marcus's harsh reality. Where are you staying tonight? Jake asked. Marcus shrugged. There's a 24-hour laundromat about 6 blocks from here. If I buy a coffee and sit in the corner, they usually don't bother me until morning. The casual way Marcus described his survival strategy broke Jake's heart. This was a man who had led soldiers in combat, who had made life and death decisions under fire, who had earned medals for valor, and he was grateful for the chance to spend a night in a laundromat. Not tonight, Jake said firmly. Tonight, you're coming home with me. We're going to have that dinner I promised, and then you're going to sleep in a real bed. Marcus started to protest, but Jake cut him off. Sergeant, that's not a request. That's an order from a superior officer. Despite everything, Marcus smiled at the familiar military authority in Jake's voice. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something again, connected to someone who understood not just his service, but the man he had been before everything fell apart. As they walked through the city streets toward Jake's apartment, both men knew that this reunion was more than just a chance encounter. It was the beginning of something that both had been missing for far too long, a brotherhood forged in combat and strengthened by mutual respect and understanding. The Christmas Eve patch that had brought them together would soon become the symbol of a new chapter in both their lives. Jake's apartment was everything Marcus had forgotten civilian life could be. Warm, clean, organized, and filled with the small comforts that made a house feel like home. As they entered, Marcus hesitated at the doorway, suddenly aware of his appearance and the contrast between his circumstances and Jake's obvious success. Come in, Jake said, sensing his friend's discomfort. The first thing we're going to do is get you cleaned up and into some fresh clothes. I think we're about the same size. The apartment reflected Jake's military background with its neat organization and minimal decoration, but there were personal touches that spoke of a full life. Photographs on the mantelpiece showed Jake with various SEAL teams, receiving commendations, and standing with what appeared to be his family. A bookshelf held military histories mixed with novels and technical manuals. The whole space radiated the quiet confidence of someone who had found his place in the world. You have a family? Marcus asked, nodding toward a photo of Jake with a woman and 2 children. Jake's expression softened. My wife Lisa and our kids, Michael is 14 and Sarah is 12. They're visiting Lisa's parents for the holidays, or they'd be here to meet you. The name Sarah hit Marcus like a physical blow. For a moment, he was transported back to happier times when that name had meant everything to him. Jake noticed the reaction and silently cursed himself for the thoughtless reminder. I'm sorry, Jake said quietly. I wasn't thinking. Marcus shook his head. It's okay. It's a common name. And, honestly, it's good to see that one of us figured out how to make it work. Jake led Marcus to the guest bathroom and provided fresh towels, soap, and a set of civilian clothes. "Take your time," he said. "I'll start dinner. We've got a lot to talk about, but first, let's get you comfortable." As Marcus stood under the hot water of his first real shower in weeks, he allowed himself to feel emotions that he had suppressed for years. The contrast between his current situation and Jake's success was stark, but rather than feeling resentment, he found himself grateful that his sacrifice had contributed to someone's happiness. If his actions on that Christmas Eve in 2003 had helped Jake build this life, then perhaps his suffering had some meaning. When Marcus emerged from the bathroom, he found Jake in the kitchen preparing a meal with military precision. The smell of cooking food made Marcus's stomach clench with hunger. He had been surviving on whatever he could afford or find, and it had been days since he'd had a proper meal. "Sit," Jake commanded, gesturing to a chair at the kitchen table. "Tell me more about what happened after you got home from your last deployment." Over dinner, Marcus continued his story. He described the slow deterioration of his mental health, the way civilian life seemed simultaneously too fast and too slow compared to the intensity of combat operations. He talked about feeling like an alien in his own home, unable to relate to people who worried about traffic jams and television shows while he carried memories of life and death situations. The worst part wasn't the nightmares or the flashbacks, Marcus said, his voice growing quiet. It was the feeling that nothing mattered anymore. In the military, everything we did had purpose. Every mission, every training exercise, every decision could mean the difference between life and death. But civilian life, it all seemed so trivial. Jake nodded with understanding. Many military personnel struggled with that same sense of purposelessness when they returned to civilian life. The high-stakes environment of military service, where every action had clear consequences and immediate importance, was difficult to replace with the routine concerns of civilian existence. "I tried to explain it to Sarah," Marcus continued. "I tried to tell her that I felt like I was sleepwalking through life, going through the motions without any real reason to get up in the morning. But how do you explain that to someone who's never experienced anything like combat?" "It's one of the hardest parts of the transition," Jake agreed. "Even people who love us and want to understand can't really grasp what we've been through." Marcus pushed food around on his plate, his appetite diminished by the memories he was sharing. Sarah tried to be supportive at first. She encouraged me to see counselors, to take medication, to join support groups. But nothing seemed to help, and I could see her getting more frustrated and scared as time went on. "When did things start getting really bad?" "About a year after I got home for good. Emma was having a birthday party. She was turning 7. There were balloons and cake and all these kids running around laughing and screaming. It should have been a happy day, but all I could hear was the sound of children crying in Fallujah." Marcus paused, his hands trembling slightly as he remembered that day. "I had a complete breakdown right there in front of all the other parents. Started yelling for everyone to take cover, trying to shield Emma from imaginary threats. Sarah had to call the police to calm me down." Jake reached across the table and placed a steadying hand on Marcus's shoulder. He had seen similar incidents during his own service, had watched good soldiers struggle with the invisible wounds of war. "After that, Emma started being afraid of me," Marcus continued. "She would hide behind her mother when I came into the room, flinch when I tried to hug her. Sarah said I was scaring our daughter with my unpredictable behavior." "Did you get professional help after that incident?" Sarah insisted on it. "I spent 3 weeks in a psychiatric facility, got diagnosed with severe PTSD and depression. They tried different medications, different therapies, but nothing seemed to stick. I felt like I was watching my life fall apart from behind a sheet of glass, unable to do anything to stop it." Marcus took a shaky breath before continuing. "When I got out of the facility, Sarah sat me down for what she called an honest conversation. She said she couldn't live with the uncertainty anymore, never knowing when I might have another episode. She was terrified that I might accidentally hurt Emma during a flashback. She asked for a separation. She gave me an ultimatum. Either I moved out voluntarily while we figured things out, or she would take Emma and leave. She said she still loved me, but she had to protect our daughter first." Jake felt his heart break for his friend. The same protective instincts that had made Marcus a good soldier, his willingness to sacrifice himself for others, had ultimately cost him his family. Sarah's decision was understandable from a mother's perspective, but it must have felt like another combat wound for Marcus. I moved out that night, Marcus said, found a small apartment across town, and started seeing Emma on supervised visits. But even those became too difficult. I could see the fear in her eyes every time I picked her up, could feel Sarah's tension whenever I was around. The supervised visits stopped. I stopped them. I couldn't stand knowing that my presence was causing my daughter distress. Sarah and I agreed that it would be better if I stayed away until I could get my condition under better control. Marcus's voice became barely audible. I haven't seen Emma in over 2 years. She's 11 now, probably doesn't even remember much about me except for the scary parts. The silence that followed was heavy with shared understanding. Jake had seen too many military families destroyed by the invisible wounds of war, had attended too many funerals for soldiers who survived combat only to lose their battles at home. What about the divorce proceedings? Jake asked gently. Sarah was fair about everything. She didn't ask for alimony, didn't try to take more than her share of our assets. She just wanted custody of Emma and enough financial security to raise her properly. I didn't fight any of it. What kind of father would I have been in my condition? Marcus managed a bitter laugh. The ironic thing is that Sarah remarried last year. A civilian contractor who works for the State Department. Never been in combat. Never had to make life or death decisions. But he's stable and predictable and safe. Everything I couldn't be. Jake struggled to find words of comfort. The situation was tragically common among veterans, but that didn't make it any less devastating for the individuals involved. Do you ever think about trying to rebuild that relationship with Emma? He asked carefully. Marcus's expression grew distant. Every day? But what would I offer her? A father who lives in subway stations and begs for change? A man who can't hold down a job or maintain a stable living situation? You could offer her the truth about who you really are, about the service you gave to your country, about the sacrifices you made, about the fact that you love her enough to stay away when you thought that was what was best for her. Maybe, Marcus said without conviction, but that would require me to first figure out who I really am. For the past 3 years, I felt like a ghost of the man I used to be. Jake leaned forward intently. That's exactly what we're going to work on. Starting tonight. Marcus looked skeptical. Commander, I appreciate everything you're doing, but I'm not sure this is a problem that can be solved with a hot meal and a warm bed. You're right, Jake agreed. It's going to take a lot more than that. But what happened in that subway station tonight proved something important. You're still the same man who saved my life 20 years ago. You saw someone in trouble and stepped in to help, even when you had every reason to mind your own business. Jake stood up and began clearing the dishes from the table. You helped that elderly woman because it was the right thing to do, not because you expected anything in return. You faced down a group of aggressive young men without backing down. You showed dignity and control even when they were mocking your service. That's just basic human decency. No, Marcus, that's character. That's the same character that made you risk your life to save mine and my team in Fallujah. The circumstances of your life have changed, but the core of who you are, that's still there. Marcus wanted to believe Jake's words, but years of failure and disappointment had worn away his self-confidence. Even if that's true, what am I supposed to do with it? Character doesn't pay rent or put food on the table. Jake smiled, the expression of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Actually, it can. I've been thinking about this ever since I recognized you tonight. I run a small security consulting firm now, primarily working with government contracts and high-profile corporate clients. Marcus raised an eyebrow. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a chance to use your skills and experience in a meaningful way. My company specializes in threat assessment, executive protection, and security planning. All things that you're uniquely qualified to handle. Jake, I appreciate the gesture, but you saw how well my last security job worked out. I'm not exactly employee of the month material. That's because you were working alone, dealing with civilian situations that had nothing to do with your training or expertise. What I'm talking about is different. This would be working with other veterans, using the skills that the military taught you, serving clients who understand and respect your background. Jake pulled out his laptop and showed Marcus the website for his company, Morrison Security Consulting. The homepage featured photos of team members, all clearly former military personnel, along with testimonials from satisfied clients. Everyone on my team has been where you are now, Jake explained. They've all struggled with the transition to civilian life, and they've all found purpose again through this work. We're not just a security company, we're a brotherhood of warriors who take care of each other. Marcus studied the website, reading about the various services the company provided and the backgrounds of the team members. Many of their stories sounded familiar: combat veterans who had struggled with PTSD, failed relationships, and difficulty adjusting to civilian life. You really think I could fit in with this group? I know you could. But, more importantly, I think you need to be part of something again. You've been isolated for too long, carrying all of this weight by yourself. Working with people who understand your experience could be exactly what you need to start healing. Jake closed the laptop and looked directly at Marcus. I'm not offering you charity. This would be a real job with real responsibilities. You'd have to prove yourself just like anyone else. But I know your capabilities, and I know your character. Given the chance, I believe you could not only succeed but thrive. Marcus felt a stirring of something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the desperate, fleeting hope of finding a warm place to sleep or getting enough money for a meal, but genuine hope for the future. The possibility of being useful again, of having purpose beyond mere survival. What would be the first step? He asked cautiously. The first step is getting you stable housing and basic necessities. I have a furnished apartment that I use for out-of-town employees. You can stay there while you get back on your feet. Jake, I can't accept that much help. It's too much. It's not help, it's an investment. I'm investing in a valuable employee and a brother in arms. Besides, you saved my life once. This hardly makes us even. Marcus felt tears threatening for the first time in months. The idea of having a real home again, of belonging somewhere, of contributing something meaningful, it was almost too much to process. There would be conditions, Jake continued. You'd need to commit to regular therapy sessions with someone who specializes in veteran mental health. You'd need to work on developing healthy coping mechanisms for your PTSD. And, eventually, when you're ready, I think you should consider reaching out to Emma. The mention of his daughter brought Marcus back to earth. I don't know about that last part. What if I'm not capable of being the father she deserves? What if you are? What if the stability and purpose of meaningful work helps you heal enough to rebuild that relationship? What if Emma is old enough now to understand that her father isn't a scary monster, but a man who was wounded while serving his country? Jake leaned forward earnestly. Marcus, your daughter is 11 years old. In a few years, she'll be old enough to make her own decisions about whether she wants a relationship with you. Don't you think she deserves the chance to know the real story of who her father is and what he sacrificed? Marcus wiped his eyes, struggling to maintain his composure. The thought of seeing Emma again, of having the chance to explain why he had stayed away, was both terrifying and exhilarating. I'm scared, he admitted. What if I screw this up? What if I'm not strong enough to handle the responsibility? Then, you'll have people around you to help. You won't be facing this alone anymore. Jake stood up and extended his hand to Marcus. So what do you say, Sergeant? Ready to rejoin the fight? Marcus looked at the offered hand for a long moment, thinking about everything that had led him to this point. The failures, the losses, the years of struggle and despair. But also the moments of courage and sacrifice that had defined his best self. He reached out and grasped Jake's hand, feeling for the first time in years like he was taking a step towards something positive rather than just trying to survive another day. Yes, sir, he said with growing conviction. I'm ready. As they shook hands, both men understood that this was more than just an employment agreement. It was the renewal of a bond forged in combat, tested by time and adversity, and ultimately strengthened by mutual respect and brotherhood. The Christmas Eve patch that had brought them together was about to become the symbol of a new beginning. 6 months after that fateful night in the subway station, Marcus Thompson sat in the comfortable office of Morrison Security Consulting, reviewing threat assessments for a client presentation. The transformation in his appearance was remarkable: clean-shaven, wearing a well-fitted business suit, his posture straight and confident. More importantly, the hollow look that had haunted his eyes for years had been replaced by something resembling peace. The road to recovery hadn't been easy. The first few weeks in the furnished apartment that Jake had provided were some of the most difficult of Marcus's life. After years of survival mode, The sudden security and comfort felt almost overwhelming. He would wake up in panic, forgetting where he was, expecting to find himself back on the streets. The therapy sessions that Jake had insisted upon were initially painful. Dr. Rachel Martinez, a psychologist who specialized in treating combat veterans, pushed Marcus to confront emotions and memories that he had spent years trying to suppress. You've been running from your pain for so long that you've forgotten how to stand still and face it, she told him during one particularly difficult session. But healing requires you to stop running and start processing what you've experienced. Slowly, with Dr. Martinez's help, Marcus began to understand that his PTSD wasn't a sign of weakness or failure. It was a normal response to abnormal circumstances, a wound that needed treatment just like any physical injury. He learned coping techniques for managing his triggers and gradually began to see glimpses of the man he had been before the war changed him. Working at Morrison Security proved to be exactly what Jake had promised, a chance to use his military skills in a meaningful way while surrounded by people who understood his experiences. The other team members, all veterans themselves, created an environment where Marcus never had to explain or apologize for his struggles. His first assignment was a relatively simple security assessment for a corporate office building, but Marcus approached it with the same thoroughness and attention to detail that had made him an effective soldier. His report identified several vulnerabilities that other firms had missed, and the client was impressed enough to request him specifically for future projects. As his confidence grew, Marcus began taking on more complex assignments. He provided executive protection for a senator who had been receiving threats, developed security protocols for a tech company handling sensitive government contracts, and even consulted on a documentary about veteran issues. Each successful project reinforced his sense of purpose and belonging. He was no longer just surviving from day to day. He was building something meaningful again. 3 months into his employment, Jake had suggested that Marcus consider moving into his own apartment. The furnished place had served its purpose, but Jake believed that having his own space would be an important step in reclaiming his independence. Marcus found a modest one-bedroom apartment just a few miles from the office. It wasn't fancy, but it was his. As he unpacked his few belongings, mostly new clothes and items that Jake had helped him acquire, he came across the old military jacket that had been his only possession during his homeless years. He held it up to the light, examining the patches that told the story of his service. The Christmas Eve patch was still there, slightly faded but intact. Instead of being ashamed of the jacket as a reminder of his lowest point, Marcus now saw it as a symbol of survival and resilience. He hung it in his closet with pride. Around this same time, Dr. Martinez began gently pushing Marcus to consider reconnecting with his daughter Emma. The topic had come up several times in their sessions, but Marcus had always changed the subject or found reasons to postpone any action. "Your avoidance of this issue is understandable," she said during one session. "You're afraid of rejection, afraid of causing more pain. But consider the possibility that Emma might benefit from knowing her father, even if that relationship looks different than it did before." "She's 12 now," Marcus said. "She has a stepfather who's probably been more of a parent to her than I ever was. What right do I have to disrupt her life? You have the right of being her biological father who loves her and wants what's best for her. That doesn't mean forcing your way back into her life, but it might mean giving her the option to know you as you are now." The conversation that changed everything came from an unexpected source. Marcus was working late one evening when Jake knocked on his office door. "I need to talk to you about something," Jake said, his expression serious. Marcus looked up from his computer, concerned by his friend's tone. "What's wrong?" Jake sat down across from Marcus's desk and pulled out his phone. "Lisa was doing some research for a school project with our daughter Sarah, and she came across something interesting." He showed Marcus the screen, which displayed a local newspaper article titled "Middle School Student Wins Essay Contest About Military Families." Marcus read the headline with confusion. "I don't understand. What does this have to do with me?" "Read the article," Jake said quietly. Marcus began reading, and his heart stopped when he saw the name of the essay winner: Emma Thompson, 7th grade student at Riverside Middle School. The article included excerpts from Emma's winning essay, which was about the challenges faced by military families. Marcus read with growing emotion as his daughter wrote about her father, whom she described as a hero who served our country, but came home hurt in ways that people couldn't see. Emma wrote, "My dad fought in dangerous places to keep America safe, but when he came home, the war followed him. He tried to be a good father, but the things he saw and did overseas made it hard for him to be around people, even people he loved. Some people think that means he was weak or that he gave up on our family, but I think it means he loved us so much that he stayed away when he thought he might accidentally hurt us." The essay concluded, "I want people to know that just because a soldier comes home doesn't mean the war is over for them. My dad is still fighting, just in a different way. I hope someday he'll know that I'm proud of him and that I understand why he had to go away. I want him to know that I remember the good times we had before he got hurt, and I hope maybe we can make new good memories someday." Marcus finished reading with tears streaming down his face. His daughter hadn't forgotten him or dismissed him as a failure. She had understood, in her 12-year-old way, exactly what he had been going through. "How did Lisa find this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was researching articles about military families for Sarah's social studies project. She recognized your last name and Emma's age, so she showed me the article to see if it might be your daughter." Jake leaned forward earnestly. "Marcus, your daughter is trying to reach you through this essay. She's telling the world that she wants a relationship with her father. But what if Sarah doesn't want me back in Emma's life? What if this will cause problems for their family? There's only one way to find out. You need to contact them." That night, Marcus sat in his apartment staring at his phone for hours. He had looked up Sarah's number through directory assistance, but calling felt like the most terrifying thing he had ever contemplated. What if Emma had written the essay without really understanding what it would mean to have him back in her life? What if Sarah hung up on him? What if he had waited too long? Finally, drawing on the same courage that had gotten him through combat missions, he dialed the number. Sarah answered on the third ring. "Hello. Sarah, it's Marcus." The words came out in a rush, as if he was afraid he would lose his nerve if he spoke too slowly. There was a long pause. "Marcus? I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I saw Emma's essay in the newspaper. Jake's wife found it online." Another pause. "You saw it. Sarah, I need you to know that I never stopped loving Emma. I stayed away because I thought it was what was best for her. But if there's any chance that she really wants to see me—" "Marcus," Sarah interrupted, her voice softer than he had expected. "Emma asks about you all the time. She's been asking if she could try to contact you. But I didn't know how to reach you." The relief that washed over Marcus was overwhelming. "I've been getting help. I'm in therapy, I have a job, an apartment. I'm not the same person I was 3 years ago." "I'm glad to hear that. I really am. I never wanted to keep Emma away from you permanently. I just needed to know that you were in a place where you could be safe for her to be around." They talked for over an hour, with Sarah filling Marcus in on Emma's life and interests. She was doing well in school, played soccer, and had developed a passion for writing that was clearly evident in her essay. She had also been asking increasingly sophisticated questions about her father's military service and mental health struggles. "She's old enough now to understand more about what you went through," Sarah said. "Her stepfather Tom has been great about not trying to replace you. He's always encouraged Emma to be proud of her biological father's service." They arranged for Marcus to meet Emma the following weekend at a neutral location, a park where they used to play when she was younger. Sarah would be there too, but she promised to give them space to reconnect. The days leading up to the meeting were among the longest of Marcus's life. He consulted with Dr. Martinez about how to approach the conversation with Emma, practiced what he might say, and worried endlessly about whether he would disappoint his daughter. Jake and the other team members at Morrison Security were incredibly supportive, offering advice and encouragement. Several of them had gone through similar reunifications with their own children, and they shared their experiences freely. "The most important thing is to be honest," advised Mike Patterson, a former Army Ranger who had reconnected with his teenage son after years of separation. "Kids can handle the truth better than we think, especially when it comes from a place of love." Saturday morning arrived crisp and clear. Marcus put on casual clothes, jeans, and a sweater, wanting to look approachable rather than intimidating. At the last minute, he decided to wear the Christmas Eve patch on his jacket, not the old military field jacket, but pinned to a civilian coat. Emma was waiting on a bench with Sarah when Marcus arrived at the park. At 12 years old, she had grown tall and gangly, with Sarah's blonde hair and what Marcus hoped were his own serious brown eyes. She stood up when she saw him approaching, her expression nervous but determined. "Hi, Dad," she said simply. The word Dad nearly broke Marcus's composure. He had wondered if she would even remember to call him that, if she would be comfortable with the title after so much time apart. "Hi, Emma," he managed to say. "You've grown so much." They sat on the bench together while Sarah discreetly moved to give them privacy. For a few minutes, they simply looked at each other, both trying to bridge the gap that time and circumstance had created. "I read your essay," Marcus said finally. "It was beautiful, and it meant more to me than you'll ever know." Emma's face brightened. "Really? I wasn't sure if you would see it. I kind of hoped you would, though. You wrote that you understood why I stayed away. I need you to know how hard that was for me. Not a day went by that I didn't think about you and wonder if I was making the right choice." Emma nodded solemnly. "Mom explained to me about PTSD and how sometimes people's brains get hurt in ways that don't show. She said you stayed away because you loved me, not because you didn't want to be my dad anymore." The maturity in her response amazed Marcus. This wasn't the frightened little girl he remembered from his last visit. This was a young woman who had clearly thought deeply about complex emotional issues. "I've been getting help," Marcus told her. "I'm in therapy, and I have a job working with other veterans. I'm learning how to manage the problems that made it hard for me to be around people before. Are you still sad sometimes?" Marcus considered how to answer truthfully without frightening her. "Sometimes I am, but I'm learning better ways to handle those feelings. And having hope of getting to know you again has made me feel happier than I've felt in a very long time." They spent the next 2 hours talking, walking around the park, and slowly rebuilding the connection that had been interrupted by his struggles. Emma told him about school, her friends, her soccer team, and her writing. Marcus shared stories about his job and the other veterans he worked with, carefully choosing details that would help her understand his current life without overwhelming her. As their time together drew to a close, Emma looked at the patch on his jacket with curiosity. "What's that one?" she asked, pointing to the Christmas Eve patch. Marcus smiled, realizing that this was the perfect opportunity to share the story that had brought him back from the brink. "This patch commemorates something that happened on Christmas Eve in 2003 when I was serving in Iraq. My unit saved the lives of some Navy SEALs, and one of those SEALs never forgot what we did." He told her about Jake, about their reunion in the subway station, and about how recognizing the patch had led to Marcus getting the help he needed to rebuild his life. "So that little patch helped you find your friend again?" Emma asked. "It did. And, in a way, it helped me find my way back to you too." Emma hugged him then, the first physical contact they had shared in years. Marcus held his daughter close, marveling at how much she had grown and how much strength she possessed. "Can we do this again next weekend?" she asked as they walked back towards Sarah. "I'd like that very much," Marcus replied. "If it's okay with your mom and Tom." "It's more than okay," Sarah said, having overheard the question. "Emma's been happier in the last week, just knowing she was going to see you, than she's been in months." As Marcus drove home that evening, he reflected on the long journey that had brought him to this moment. From the depths of homelessness and despair to reconnecting with his daughter, it seemed impossible that so much could change in just 6 months. But he also understood that the real work was just beginning. Rebuilding his relationship with Emma would require consistency, patience, and continued commitment to his own mental health. There would be challenges ahead, setbacks, and difficult conversations, and moments when his old symptoms resurfaced. However, for the first time in years, Marcus felt equipped to handle whatever came next. He had found his purpose again through his work with Morrison Security. He had a support system of fellow veterans who understood his struggles. He had professional help from Dr. Martinez to guide him through the ongoing process of healing. Most importantly, he had hope. Hope for a future that included being a father to Emma, hope for continued recovery, and hope that his experiences might help other veterans who were facing similar battles. The Christmas Eve patch that had once been just a reminder of a night in Iraq had become a symbol of survival, brotherhood, and redemption. It represented the truth that no one is ever truly lost as long as there are people willing to recognize their worth and extend a helping hand. Marcus thought about all the homeless veterans who were still out there, struggling with the same demons that had nearly destroyed him. Through his work with Morrison Security and his ongoing recovery, he was determined to be for them what Jake had been for him. A brother who would never give up, never stop looking, and never forget the bonds forged in service to their country. As he pulled into his apartment complex, Marcus made a mental note to call Jake and thank him once again for seeing past the homeless man in the subway station to the soldier underneath. Some friendships, he realized, transcend time, circumstances, and even the wounds of war. The Christmas Eve of 2003 had created a bond between two warriors. The Christmas Eve that was now approaching would celebrate the renewal of that bond and the beginning of a new chapter in both their lives. Marcus smiled as he climbed the stairs to his apartment, already planning what he would write in a letter to Emma that would tell her the complete story of her father's service, his struggles, and his journey back to the man she could be proud to call Dad. The war was finally over. The real healing could begin.